and thank you for joining us for Naviant's webinar on key strategies for best-in-class accounts payable. Thank you for taking the time today. My name is Guy Schrader. I am Manager of Sales Engineering with Naviant, and with me today as a presenter sitting in the same room is Ed Majeska. He is our Director of Strategic Accounts. Without any further ado, just a few housekeeping items. Reminder that your voice is muted, so please use the chat box in the GoToWebinar if you have any questions, and please take the time at the end of the webinar to answer the survey so that we can help serve you better in the future. So with that, where we'd like to start with this presentation is to talk about some of the industry metrics and benchmarks that are out there. And there's numerous different organizations that do surveys for accounts payable. If you work in accounts payable, you've probably seen some of these coming from organizations such as the Accounts Payable Network. We'll talk about a couple other ones that come up here. But the Accounts Payable Network is what we'll focus on first. And very high level, they came back and said that 54% of organizations that they surveyed measure their accounts payable performance in some form or fashion, with larger organizations being more likely to use some type of metrics to gauge that AP performance. And what you can see in the screen right now is here are the different metrics that people stated were important to them. And following that are the percentage of respondents that stated that these different metrics were their top metrics. So you can see here volume or number of invoices processed by individual, on-time payments, days payable outstanding, accuracy or error rates, cost per invoice, so on and so forth in the order that those came down. We're going to focus on two of these today because I think both of these are very telling metrics. If we can make a suggestion, I think these two key that we'd recommend that your organization follow and measure as you go along. So we're going to talk about both of these. But before we jump into that, let's quickly do a GoToWebinar poll. So up on your screen, you should see the question right now. How many invoices per month do each of your full-time equivalent accounts payable clerks process? If you have no idea, there's definitely an option for that, but less than 1,000, in the 1,000 range, in the 2,000 range, or more than 3,000 invoices. And looking at the survey responses coming back, most of you are in that between 1,000 and 2,000 range. There's a spattering that are less than 1,000. Well, let's take a look at the survey results that came back from the Accounts Payable Network. And you can see here they break things into a few different quartiles. And we're trying to follow that here. First quartile would be considered those organizations that are considered to be best-in-class performers. The median, obviously, the middle of the pack. The third quartile would be those laggards. But you can see those best-in-class organizations are processing approximately 2,500 invoices per FTE on a monthly basis. Compare that to those laggards. You can see 3.7 times more invoices per month per FTE, comparing those two categories. So obviously some huge improvements if you can move into that first quartile. Let's pose one more question to the group here. Again, for your organization, what's the cost to process an invoice? And some of you folks might have no idea, depending upon whether you measure that within your organization. But some of the other choices, more than $10 per invoice, between $5 and $10 per invoice, between $2.50 and $5 per invoice, and less than $2.50. So again, seeing the majority of the responses coming in, we're seeing between $5 and $10 per invoice seems to be about the average. Good majority of you have no idea, and that's not surprising because a lot of organizations don't seem to measure this overly well. Well, again, going back to now a few different surveys. This is, again, the Accounts Payable Network, but including the Aberdeen Group and the Institute of Financial Operations and some of the different surveys that they came out with. You can see some variability here, but again, using those same three categories, those best-in-class performers are somewhere between $2 and $4 per invoice as their cost to process an invoice. That middle of the pack, we're talking $5 to a little bit short of $10, and you can see the third quartile that's somewhat all over the board, but starting at $11.53 per invoice and upward. And the logical question that ultimately comes out of this is what should your organization include as part of your cost per invoice? And there's a number of different considerations here. You can see some of the different things that are up here: your direct labor, your departmental overhead, the labor for your management to review any invoices that are considered to be exceptions or those that need to have some level of approval, transaction-based fees if you're using some different services to handle your invoices, storage, paper postage, software licensing, hardware maintenance. Those are some of the different things that we see, but I can't say that there's a magic bullet here for what you should measure. The FTE labor is very easy to utilize, as well as your departmental overhead. The key here is to stay consistent as time goes by, as you start changing and tweaking your accounts payable processes and look at introducing technology so that you can measure the improvements in performance. Going back to now quantifiable savings based upon those conservative metrics between the best-in-class performers as well as the average performers, if you're processing 100,000 invoices on an annual basis, there you're talking about a $256,000 annual savings. And that's where we're really starting to see the major benefits in improving your accounts payable operations if you can move your organization from an average organization into that best-in-class range. If you're processing $500,000, you're talking $1.2+ million of annual savings. So that is huge. Accounts payable is an area where you can definitely see some major improvements within your organization and contribute to the bottom line of the organization. One example of a customer that Naviant has worked with in the past, they came to us stating that our cost per invoice is $4.91. And as we started engaging with them, after the first year, we were able to see their cost per invoice drop to $2.20. And over time, I think right now we're in year 6 of that implementation, you can see that those costs continue to be squeezed out with an anticipated cost per invoice down to $1.58 next year as we continue just to tweak the procedures, tweaking the technology to get better recognition rates for the invoices and the processes taking place once we extract information from these documents. So again, quantifiable savings year over year compared to taking no action whatsoever. So what do the industry analysts say that you need to do to achieve best-in-class performance? Centralizing your processing is key here. You can see a majority of organizations are stating that they're doing some level of centralized processing of accounts payable. Shared services is definitely on the rise within different organizations. Automating the process. Many organizations, and the larger the organization is, the more likely that they have taken on some level of automation to the processing of accounts payable invoices. Huge in helping to squeeze those costs out. Some of the natural byproducts, you now have standardization for every single invoice, since no humans really making a specific decision on every single piece of paper or invoice that comes through your organization. But you also see those improved cycle times, the cost per invoice goes down, and you also have visibility into the status of every single invoice that comes through your organization. And automating your data capture, and this is an area where there's still a lot of improvement to be found within organizations. Only a little bit over a third, 43% of organizations have stated that they've deployed some level of data capture, and we'll talk about some of these concepts as we continue to go through this presentation. How have organizations actually adopted some of these things in some of these different areas, kind of now breaking this down into more specific technologies. And you can see the different graphs here for front-end imaging. The green is smaller organizations. Medium organizations are in blue, and the reddish-orange are the larger organizations. You can see a lot of organizations now are using front-end imaging. Again, larger the organization, the more likely that those technologies are utilized. Optical character recognition we'll talk about in a little bit. Again, there has not been a great deal of adoption with those technologies. Automated workflow, a little bit better depending upon the size of the organization. Those are really the 3 areas that we're going to focus on. You can also see how different organizations have implemented electronic payments, purchasing cards, as well as electronic invoicing. But really, the balance of our presentation is going to be focusing a lot of on those three categories on the left side of this particular slide. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed to talk about some of the different concepts of automation as well as some of the stages of automation.
Thanks, Guy. So, why are finance departments looking at changing AP? Not to be satisfied with simple top 10 lists, we put together a list of 11 top reasons that we actually typically hear from the customers that we've worked with, after the fact. Why did they need to improve their current state, and what were their objectives? Interestingly enough, oftentimes, number one, and this isn't prioritized by any means, but just to focus on number one, often and interesting, it still boils down to a paper problem. We have too much paper sitting here, sitting there, and we need to find it, and we want to get rid of those storage costs and courier costs. That often then leads to, as we start talking about current state processes and future state objectives, it really does then boil down to all of those other costs, the cost of actually processing the invoices, the manual effort, the productivity losses, and or improvements that you're going to receive by automating those processes in those future state solutions. But it really is controlling costs, reducing costs, enhancing visibility and reporting, and improving compliance and audit, both internally and externally. So really, to do this, and a big focus of this discussion and what we help customers understand is the value of enterprise content management. So what is ECM, enterprise content management? Often is confused with simple document management. That simple definition of, am I just really managing paper by scanning it and processing it? But ECM is really so much more than that. It really encompasses all of the strategic vision and tools around capturing that unstructured content, processing it, retrieving it, integrating it, measuring it, storing it, regardless if it's paper or if it's email, fax, reports, etc. All of that unstructured content as it relates to those business applications. So what you really need to think about when we talk about ECM, Enterprise Content Management, is it's really a strategic component to an organization's enterprise information management vision. So enterprise information management is really comprised of both that data, which really is in your line of business applications, and all of that unstructured and ancillary content that doesn't quite fit into those other areas, or you don't want to put it into those silos. This is actually an illustration of an actual customer of ours with multiple ERP systems, which is often typical, and multiple different user applications, where this organization had SAP and Oracle and Epicor. They used SharePoint, they used Outlook, they had multiple mobile device platforms. And what happens in their case and in most cases is that ECM tool often sits in the background and adds a transparent, enhanced functionality to augment these end-user interfaces or those existing line of business applications, email, mobile devices, web portals, whatever it might be. So as we talk with organizations, now granted every company is different, but when we're working with them, we find that there's really 7 logical considerations when thinking about those future state processes. Moving from left to right at a high level, it's really, how am I going to capture those invoices? How are they coming into the organization? Then how or if does automated recognition like OCR and IDC to extract and validate, does that make sense for us based on our volumes and people and budgets? What approvals and exceptions and verification processes do we want to automate? What systems or data do we want to integrate to? Things like who and how will users access these documents or approval forms? And from a management standpoint, what performance metrics, what dashboards, what reports are needed? And finally, what record retention considerations and what security do I need to put around this content? So there's a lot that goes into this, and for that reason, when we look at these considerations, there is no magic. AP automation needs to happen in one way. So this graph, this illustration is really hopefully to show where we see most of our customers falling into one of these, I'll call standard stages, one of these 4 standard stages. And as you would expect, as you move from left to right, your cost per invoice reduces as that automation increases. So focusing a little bit here on each one of these stages, but and give you an overview. Stage 1 is really still not much automation at all, but it's applying that concept of managing the content better. It's still a paper-based solution. but often decentralized, where the key distinction is we're still late scanning. So late scanning provides that opportunity to reduce the storage costs and reduce retrieval and customer service costs, but it's essentially creating an electronic filing cabinet where you're managing that process manually, and at the end of the process, I'm scanning, so I'm late scanning, and there's still value to that. And we have a number of organizations that will still start there. Think of it as that first baby step into the unknown. Next, I want to transition and talk about stage 2 and 3 kind of together at first. So in addition to often moving from a decentralized to a centralized capture, it's really moving from late scanning to early scanning, and it's providing you the ability to single key transactions, validate data, improve visibility, because now accounting is aware of that invoice earlier in the process through earlier scanning. But really the most important distinction is to talk about workflow comparison between 2 and 3. With stage 2, workflow is remaining primarily manual. So instances where it might be largely PO-based with minimally exceptions or approvals. However, with stage 3, it's really automating the process and those invoices and approvals through workflow. And that's where the significant value starts to begin here. So things like schedule of authority, approval limits, verifications, exception processing, even posting of those transactions can all be automated. And then finally, page 4 is really moving best of class from an automated workflow to including that level of OCR. So you can get that straight through processing. So I want to talk for a few minutes now and really cover some of these concepts that we've talked about and dovetail to what Guy shared earlier. What are those best practices for AP as it relates to enterprise content management? So it's really early capture process automation that we've been talking about, transparency, and reducing or eliminating keying. So I want to talk a little bit more about this early capture. Let's start there. Early capture and workflow. Probably one of the most important pieces. So just as we talked about with those stages a moment ago, capturing early and automating that workflow really is critical to reducing your costs and managing the content and improving the visibility. So if it is paper, yes, you have to scan it. If it's already electronic, like faxes and emails, don't print it and scan it, capture it electronically. So by capturing early, you're going to eliminate lost documents and all of those related routing and courier expenses. And then directly related, as Guy was mentioning, relative to centralization, by capturing in a centralized location, it helps to reduce those costs further. In fact, we find that through surveys that over 80% cumulative of organizations are moving to or have already moved to centrally capturing their invoices. So once captured early, now we can start to look at processing more efficiently through workflow. So the concept here is, again, those predictable business rules, those predictable business tasks can be now standardized. And things that are non-value added activities, pushing paper around, following up, those can be eliminated. And a complete audit trail is really provided to improve that compliance and improve visibility. Further, extending workflow to mobile devices for things like non-PO approvals or PO exceptions has also been on the rise the last few years, really making it easier for the users and reducing processing time delays from an administration standpoint. So let's run through a quick example of what we're talking about. So moving from left to right, the invoices come in and they're captured electronically into that ECM tool where they're presented to that AP specialist, where they're going to do that first review. Now this is that stage 3 example where we're not talking about OCR, so there's still a task for that AP specialist to review. If it is something that needs to go out for exception, moving left to right still, a PO exception that needs to go to purchasing and non-PO approval that needs to go out to a manager in a division, the ECM workflow would manage that and push that out through notifications and interactions either through mobile devices or emails, where it would then come back to that AP specialist where if it's approved or when it's approved from a PO or non-PO standpoint, they would then key from image into their ERP and or provide a batch file that needs to be committed back to that ERP. And then that ERP and that ECM would be synced up for retrieval processes. Now let's talk about integration. We kind of alluded to it a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, integration really makes the processes and the systems intuitive to the users, which is critical for user adoption and to user satisfaction. So by making ECM transparent, users don't have to switch applications. And the new ECM functionalities, so being able to retrieve documents, to share data, to find related documents, to engage with workflow tasks, those now appear to be part of the native line of business tools, the ERP tools or email tools that they're already using today. So depending on the ECM tool, there's also advanced processing that's available, such as data validation, posting transaction. That can all be done to further enhance straight-through processing. And there's a number of different approaches to ECM. But most often, we're looking at connecting that ECM tool and integrating back to the finance system, the ERP system, email system, Microsoft Outlook, or again to mobile devices, which again is probably one of the biggest rises that we've seen. And from an end user perspective, it's really that email and mobile integration is the most common. So again, by extending that ECM to email and mobile devices, now those users can access and approve their invoices, they can view those related documents, they can provide GL distribution approvals and coding via e-forms, they can upload additional needed content, again, all transparently and seamlessly. So next, I'd like to transition back to Guy to talk about reducing or eliminating keying.
Well, thank you, Ed. For anybody that's still working in an accounts payable environment where there's a lot of paper and you're doing all manual entry of this information, you realize that a lot of effort is being spent on just heads-down keying of information off of paper or even that electronic invoice in some form or fashion into your ERP system. So really this whole concept is really attempting to either reduce or eliminate all that keying into, frankly, both systems. There's some different key from image enhancements that might be out there where you can now leverage some of the information that's been keyed into one system and effectively screen scrape that information out of your ERP to populate your ECM system so that now that data stays in sync and makes for easy retrieval of information. So you're entering that information once, you're allowing your ERP system to validate that information so that you're eliminating that fat fingering of any of that data entry into the system. And again, now we enable that whole process, if we're keying from image, to begin that whole workflow process or potentially utilize e-forms. And given it's very key here to mention that a single monitor environment doesn't work overly well in that environment, so there may be some additional hardware investment to have a separate 2 monitors for every AP clerk that might be doing any level of data entry. Given that's level 1, where you're still doing that manual data entry, but now let's start introducing optical character recognition, OCR. And there's a few different levels of this, and we'll start with the most basic. Zonal OCR has been around for a long time, probably 20+ years. It's very mature. There's many different vendors on the market that do this. But really you're talking about now capturing documents and extracting information from those documents that have a static structure. When you take a look at this document, you apply a template to it, we know exactly where on this document that we're going to find the information that we want to extract. Not really a good candidate for accounts payable automation here, but maybe a scenario where you have a low number of vendors that you're dealing with that you could logically set up a template for each of those different vendors. Given we can classify these documents, saying this is an invoice versus some other document type, but then it can automatically index or screen scrape that information, I'm sorry, not screen scrape, using OCR technology, extract that information off of those documents to now utilize for both indexing the document within the ECM system, but also populating your transactional system such as your ERP. So a quick example of that, here is presented an invoice that came from the phone shack. We can set up the system where now, based upon the existence of the word invoice, specifically within the zone that you see on that invoice there, it recognizes this is an invoice document type, and that now we can go ahead and apply a template to this to know, hey, I'm looking for the vendor specifically in that location, moving down the invoice number, the date, the PO number information, now more in the body, line item details, totals, so on and so forth. Based on that XY coordinates, we're able to extract that information and now use that, again, not only for the enterprise content management system, but also to populate your ERP. Take that to the next level here, because really, think about it, in most environments, you're dealing with thousands, if not tens of thousands of different vendors that you're dealing with. And setting up a single template for each of those different vendors is not realistic. Introduce advanced optical character recognition for unstructured documents here. And really those words resound pretty well. Unstructured documents meaning we know that the information that we're looking for is somewhere on this document, but exactly where we're going to find it is going to vary from one document to the next. And invoices is a perfect example of that. So in this scenario, the technologies have the capability of doing advanced search on this. And all things said and done, we don't have to set up templates here. There's enough intelligence built in where it knows how to find the invoice number, the invoice date, the dollar amounts, the purchase order number, so on and so forth. But now the technology can lift that information off of the document, classify the document, again based upon these different technologies, but also index that document and ultimately populate the ERP system. But they also have some complex rules built into it, so we can validate some of this information that's being extracted, making sure that's going to be acceptable by our ERP system. That now allows us to do a high percentage of straight-through processing invoices. Somebody touches those invoices initially to prepare a batch when you're talking about paper-based invoices, but once they run through the scanner, a good percentage of those documents are posted automatically to your ERP system since all the validation rules have been satisfied. So a graphical example of what actually is happening here, the system is able to scan that invoice, read through and be able to recognize where those key data elements are that we're looking for. As you can see here, recognizing the vendor information, invoice information, line item details, PO number, totals, so on and so forth. It's great that systems are capable of doing this, but we don't stop specifically there because, again, there is the case where OCR errors can be introduced here as we go through things. So you can take something like a purchase order number, for example. As Ed alluded to before, one of our customers actually has many different ERP systems, so we can take that purchase order number and look through the different systems and say, okay, which system did this come from? But now by finding that match within an ERP system, we can return back the vendor information and all the line item details for what was ordered and begin to do line pairing against the actual content that was extracted from the invoice. Again, increasing the chance that we can do that straight through processing without any human intervention. If everything matches, great. Post that transaction. If there is an issue in some form or fashion, then we may very well need to present that to an operator who takes a look at that information. They're using brain cycles now to figure out what actually happened between the purchase order, potentially the packing slip, and the invoice so that we can post that transaction appropriately. So some of the benefits that we see here, we're able to go ahead and complete those transactions even faster. A lot of that non-value added task of manual data entry goes away. Users are now moving away from manual indexing more into a data validation perspective. They're looking at those exceptions to the rule. Your processing times are improved. Complex OCR requirements are being satisfied, and this is what those best-in-class organizations are doing. They're using this technology. Given these technologies cost more money, so you have a larger investment, but you're able to see a much higher return on investment where a lot of those costs are now being removed from that particular process. So to now recap with the summary recommendations, I'm going to turn it back on over to Ed.
Thanks, Guy. We won't keep you long, but again, really wanted to summarize kind of our conversations today. And key to that, to start with, is again looking at enterprise content management and business process management as strategic. Yes, it may solve a technical problem, but again, building that leadership vision and engaging management to assure that that ECM strategy and BPM strategy aligns with your enterprise information management vision is critically important. With that, and I know we've talked about each one of these, centralization is really, I don't want to say a trend, it's here. It really helps you drive cost reductions, improve controls and reporting, and eliminating redundant operations. So either through just centralized processing or creating a shared service department is something we see quite often, engage with quite often. Capturing early and automating, I know we've talked about that a lot, but again, it is really where your processing benefits come from. By capturing it early, you can automate those workflows and schedule authorities and approvals and improve visibility and controls and let the system do the work for you. And then finally, adding the value of integration. You know, by integrating to those systems, by integrating to that line of business accounting package, email, mobile devices, you're creating that transparency and user adoption and acceptance that's going to improve the efficiency of that solution. And then really finally, don't want to overlook the importance of planning. Planning is really critical to whatever you do. You know, AP is AP, yes, but every organization has processes and exceptions that are unique. So whether you engage us, Naviant, or not, can't stress enough that proper planning before you implement will determine the success of your project. We recommend not leading with technology. Far too often we see organizations spend too much time looking at software demos and letting the technology determine what their new process is going to be, and instead we strongly recommend starting with your planning and looking at what are your processes and how do you want people to engage with those processes to finally to determine what technologies align with what you want those future state processes to be. So really separate planning from implementation. So with that, thank you again for joining us this morning. If you have any questions, we encourage you to call or email us. Our phone and emails are up here on the screen. Call or email us directly, or just check out our website. It's been newly updated with a lot of great new content information, including overviews and case studies and videos. So thank you again.